Every year, around 8 million people walk across the Sydney Harbour Bridge. They stop at the midpoint, pull out their phones, and take the same photograph. The Opera House on one side, Circular Quay on the other. The harbour sparkling underneath. It is, without question, the single most photographed piece of infrastructure in the Southern Hemisphere. And almost none of them have any idea what was destroyed to build it. They stand on the very spot where a neighbourhood once existed, where families raised children in sandstone terraces, where workers drank at corner pubs after long shifts on the wharves, where women hung laundry across narrow laneways that had been there since the earliest days of the colony. All of it gone. Demolished. Erased so completely that most Sydney-siders today could not name a single street that disappeared. That was 1923. By 1932, the bridge was open, the nation was celebrating, and the people who had lost everything were already being forgotten. So how did Australia's greatest engineering triumph become one of its darkest stories of displacement? And why has almost nobody told the full story of the neighborhood they demolished to build it? This is the complete account. Every demolished street, every displaced family, every decision that was made, and every consequence that was ignored. It starts long before anyone picked up a demolition hammer. And it ends in a way that should make every Australian who has ever admired the bridge stop and think about what they are actually looking at. It was the 1830s, and the stretch of harbourfront land on Sydney's southern shore, known as the Rocks, was already the beating heart of the colony. This was where the first fleet had landed in 1788, where the convicts had built the first rough shelters from timber and bark, where sandstone had been quarried from the ridgeline to construct the buildings of a fledgling European settlement on Aboriginal land. The name itself came from the rocky outcrops that defined the terrain, jutting up from the harbour's edge in uneven layers that gave the streets their crooked, winding character. If you walked through the Rocks in 1840, you would have found a neighborhood already dense with life. The streets followed the contours of the ridge rather than any formal grid plan, creating a maze of narrow lanes, steep staircases, and unexpected turns. Argyle Street cut east-west through a natural gap in the ridge. George Street North ran along the lower slopes toward Circular Quay. Cumberland Street traced the high ground. Between them, a web of smaller lanes connected the terraces, the workshops, the boarding houses, and the pubs. And the pubs were everywhere. The hero of Waterloo, built from sandstone quarried on the site itself, opened in 1843. The fortune of war claimed to be Sydney's oldest, the Lord Nelson, the Palisade. Each one an unofficial community center for the maritime workers who lived within stumbling distance of the bar. By the middle of the 19th century, the Rocks had become one of the most densely populated areas in Australia. Narrow laneways threaded between rows of sandstone terrace houses that had been built in the 1840s and 1850s. Workers' cottages pressed up against one another on streets barely wide enough for a horse and cart. Sailors, wharfies, dock laborers, stonemasons, coopers, sailmakers, and their families packed into a district that hummed with activity from dawn until well past dark. The harbour was the engine that drove everything. Ships arrived constantly at the wharves running from Dawes Point to Circular Quay. The waterfront was one of Sydney's largest employers, and the men who worked those wharves lived in the Rocks because they had to. You lived where you worked, and you worked where the ships came in. The terrace houses were 2 stories, built from local sandstone with iron roofs. Some had been subdivided so many times that entire families lived in a single room. The sanitation was poor. Tuberculosis was common, but the conditions did not diminish the community. Generations of families had been born, married, and buried within the same few blocks. Children grew up knowing every laneway, every shopkeeper by name. There was a grocer on every second corner, a butcher, a baker, a newsagent. Small businesses that depended on foot traffic from the surrounding terraces and knew their customers by name and by account. There were churches, schools, a mechanics institute where working men could borrow books and attend lectures. There was a rhythm to the place that had been established over decades, and that felt, to the people who lived it, permanent. It was not glamorous, it was not wealthy, but it was theirs. And that sense of ownership, of belonging, of rootedness in a specific place, would prove to be the thing most completely destroyed when the demolitions came. That sense of belonging had already been tested once before, and the scars from that first assault had never fully healed. In January of 1900, a dock worker named Arthur Payne was diagnosed with bubonic plague. The disease had arrived aboard cargo ships carried by rats that infested every wharf on the waterfront. The Rocks, with its dense housing, was at the epicenter. The NSW government declared a public health emergency and unleashed a campaign of forced cleansing. Entire blocks were condemned. Houses were quarantined and fumigated. Under emergency health powers, the government resumed large tracts of land, seizing properties privately owned for decades. Hundreds of dwellings were demolished. The official justification was public health. But even as the plague was being contained, officials spoke openly about improving the rocks by clearing away the working-class housing. The plague killed 103 people. The demolitions displaced far more. By the time the plague passed, the rocks was permanently diminished. Entire blocks had been cleared. Vacant lots dotted the hillside, and the land resumed by the government sat empty for years, waiting. Nobody was paying attention to what that empty land meant. But in less than 2 decades, the space cleared by the plague would become the foundation for a project that would finish what the disease had started. Across the harbor on the northern shore, Milson's Point sat at the water's edge directly opposite the rocks. Where the rocks was dense and rough-edged, Milson's Point was quieter, more residential. Timber cottages with wide verandas lined streets like Alfred Street and Lavender Street. Families had built homes there for the harbor views, the sea breeze, and the distance from the southern grime. Lavender Bay curved into a sheltered inlet where children swam in summer and fishermen cast lines from the rocks. It was suburban in the best sense, a community defined by proximity and shared routines. But Milson's Point had a geographical problem it could not escape. Its position, directly across the narrowest point of the harbor, made it the only logical landing point for any bridge. The very geography that made it beautiful also made it a target. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. The idea of bridging Sydney Harbour was almost as old as European settlement. As far back as 1815, the convict architect Francis Greenway proposed a crossing. His vision was impractical for the era, but the seed was planted. Over the following decades, proposals surfaced with the regularity of a harbor tide. Floating bridges, cantilever bridges, suspension bridges, tunnels. In 1900, the government invited formal tenders and rejected every one as too costly. The pattern was always the same. Someone proposed a bridge. Excitement flared, and the project collapsed under the weight of cost, politics, and engineering difficulty. For over a century, Sydney Harbour remained unbridged. Ferries carried passengers back and forth in a system that was picturesque but inadequate. By the early 1900s, the morning crush at Milson's Point Wharf was a daily ordeal. Hundreds of commuters jostled on the narrow platform, sometimes waiting through 3 departures before boarding. Moving goods between the shores required ferry transport that was slow, weather-dependent, and limited. What the city needed was someone stubborn enough to push a bridge through every barrier. In 1912, the NSW Public Works Department appointed such a man. In 1912, the NSW Public Works Department appointed such a man. In 1912, the NSW Public Works Department appointed such a man. His name was John Job Crew Bradfield. Bradfield was born near Ipswich, Queensland, in 1867. He studied engineering at the University of Sydney and joined the NSW Public Works Department. When appointed chief engineer of the bridge project, the bridge existed only as a folder of rejected proposals. He studied crossings around the world, traveling to inspect the Hellgate Bridge in New York and the Forth Bridge in Scotland. He spent a decade producing engineering reports, refining designs, and lobbying politicians. The First World War interrupted him, but by the early 1920s the political stars aligned, and the government committed to the project. But Bradfield's plans contained a detail that received remarkably little scrutiny. The bridge required massive approach structures on both shores, carrying traffic up to deck height, over 50 meters above the waterline. These needed enormous amounts of land, and the land was covered in houses. Lines on a plan. The drawings showed the elegant sweep of the approach spans. They did not show the families. In July of 1922, the NSW Parliament passed the Sydney Harbour Bridge Act. The legislation did more than authorize construction. It gave the government extraordinary powers of compulsory acquisition. Under the Act, any private property deemed necessary for the bridge, its approaches, its access roads, or any associated works could be resumed by the Crown. The government's own valuers would determine the compensation. Owners could dispute the amount through a formal process, but they could not dispute the resumption itself. No appeal, no court order, no petition could prevent the government from taking your home once it had been marked for acquisition. The compensation provisions were framed as fair. In practice, they were anything but. Government valuers assessed properties according to their official classification, and much of the rocks was classified as slum housing. Properties that families had maintained for decades, that had been improved and extended over generations, were valued at rates that reflected the government's view of the district, not the residents' experience of their homes. A terrace house that a family had occupied since the 1870s might be valued at a fraction of what it would cost to purchase even a modest home elsewhere in Sydney. There was no provision for relocation assistance, no funding for moving costs, no program to help displaced families find alternative housing. The government would take your home, pay you what it decided your home was worth, and consider its obligation fulfilled. The act received broad political support. The bridge was popular, the engineering was exciting, the economic benefits were obvious, and the people who would bear the highest cost, the working-class residents of the Rocks and Milsons Point, did not have the political power to mount an effective opposition. They were laborers, dock workers, washerwomen, and widows. They did not dine with parliamentarians. They did not own newspapers. They had no organized advocacy group to speak on their behalf. The Sydney Harbour Bridge Act passed, and the demolition countdown began. The first resumption notices arrived in 1923, and they arrived like eviction orders. Government surveyors had already moved through the Rocks and Milsons Point, mapping every property in the path of the bridge and its approaches. Streets had been measured, buildings had been assessed, the corridor of destruction had been precisely calculated. Now the notices went out, property by property, family by family. The process was administrative and impersonal. A formal letter informed the property owner, or in many cases the long-term tenant, that their home had been compulsorily acquired by the Crown pursuant to the Sydney Harbour Bridge Act. They were required to vacate by a specified date. The timeframes were short. Some families received weeks. Others received a few months at most. For those who had lived in the same house for their entire lives, who had inherited their tenancy from parents who had held it before them, the notice was not just a legal document. It was the end of everything they knew. Princes Street was among the first to go on the southern side. This was a narrow lane running through the heart of the Rocks, lined with two-story sandstone terraces that had been built in the 1840s and 1850s. Some of the oldest residential buildings in Sydney stood on Princes Street. Families who had lived there for 3 generations received their notices and began the process of dismantling their lives. Where do you go when the government takes your home? In 1923, the options for a working-class Sydney family were limited. The inner city was already crowded. Housing in the suburbs was expensive and poorly connected by public transport. The compensation payments, when they arrived, were often too small to cover the cost of comparable accommodation elsewhere. Some families moved in with relatives. Others found rooms in boarding houses. Some simply scattered, their household dissolved along with their address. The demolition crews followed the notices within weeks. The process was efficient and thorough. Roof tiles were stripped first, then the timber framing, then the walls were pulled down, sandstone block by sandstone block. The rubble was carted away or used as fill. Within days of a family's departure, the house they had lived in for decades was a flat patch of cleared ground. Gloucester Street lost entire blocks of terraces. Cumberland Street, which ran along the ridge above the Rocks, was carved back to make way for the southern approach ramps. George Street North saw buildings pulled down on its western side. Essex Street, Harrington Street, Playfair Street, all of them lost buildings, some lost entire stretches. Laneways that had no formal name, that were known only to the people who used them as shortcuts between the main roads, were graded flat and absorbed into the construction site. I mean, think about that for a second. Streets so old they predated formal naming, paths worn into the sandstone by a century of footsteps, erased in an afternoon. The demolitions were not limited to houses. Churches were pulled down. The Congregational Church on Gloucester Street, which had served the community since the 1840s, was demolished. Schools were closed and their buildings razed. Small businesses lost their premises. The corner shop where you had bought milk every morning for 20 years was suddenly a pile of rubble with a construction fence around it. The social infrastructure of the Rocks was destroyed as methodically as the physical infrastructure. Every demolished shop meant a shopkeeper without a livelihood and customers without a supplier. Every demolished pub meant a gathering place gone. Every demolished church meant a congregation scattered. The community was not just displaced, it was disassembled, piece by piece, institution by institution, until the web of relationships that had held it together simply could not function anymore. Consider the people who lived in these houses. There were widows in their 70s who had never lived anywhere else. Their entire social world existed within walking distance. When the resumption notice arrived, they did not just lose a house. They lost every relationship that made daily life possible. There were dock workers' families with 5 children crammed into a 2-bedroom terrace, no savings, no motor car. When the compensation check arrived, if it arrived at all, it was not enough to rent a comparable house anywhere in Sydney, and the tenants received nothing at all. Compensation went to the property owner. If you had rented a house for 40 years, the government owed you nothing. In a neighborhood where the majority were tenants, most displaced people received zero compensation, not a reduced amount. Nothing. And here is the detail that everyone missed. The areas being demolished were exclusively working class. Every alternative alignment would have encroached on wealthier properties the government was less willing to sacrifice. Nobody in Potts Point lost their home. Nobody in Mosman, nobody in Vaucluse. The geography of the destruction mapped perfectly onto the geography of class. The compensation process for those property owners who did receive payments ground on alongside the demolitions, and it was here that the injustice cut deepest. Families who had maintained their homes with pride, who had extended kitchens and repaired roofs and planted gardens in tiny backyards, found their improvements counted for almost nothing in the government assessment. The valuers assessed the land and the structure. They did not assess the community. They did not assess the generations of habitation. They did not assess what it meant to lose the only home you had ever known. Some owners contested the valuations. The wealthier ones, those who could afford solicitors, sometimes negotiated higher settlements. But the process was slow, adversarial, and stacked in the government's favor. The government had the resources to litigate indefinitely. The displaced family needed money now, today, to pay rent on wherever they had landed after leaving their home. Most accepted what was offered. They had no practical alternative. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Not in any way that made a difference. The newspapers covered the bridge project with breathless enthusiasm, reporting on engineering milestones and construction progress. The displacement of families was occasionally mentioned in passing, usually in language that framed it as an unfortunate but necessary cost of progress. No sustained journalistic investigation examined the adequacy of compensation or the fate of displaced residents. No political movement emerged to demand better treatment. The working class of the Rocks were expendable. That was the unspoken truth behind every resumption notice, every lowball valuation, every demolished terrace. The bridge was for Sydney. The cost was for them. On the northern shore, the demolitions were quieter but followed the same pitiless logic. The approach to the bridge from the Milsons Point side required a wide corridor of land running from the harbor's edge up through the residential streets behind. The northern approach would carry road traffic and railway lines on a series of spans and ramps that curved through the suburb before reaching the main arch. This corridor cut directly through the heart of Milsons Point's residential area. Houses along Alfred Street were among the first to go. Alfred Street ran parallel to the harbor foreshore, and many of its houses had been built specifically to enjoy water views. They were timber and sandstone cottages, some quite modest, others with substantial gardens and elaborate Victorian-era detailing. Their owners had purchased them for the light, the breeze, and the views across one of the most beautiful harbors in the world. The government's valuers arrived and assessed these properties using a logic that was circular and devastating. The properties were being acquired for the bridge. The bridge, once constructed, would obstruct the harbor views that gave the properties their value. Therefore, the valuers argued, the properties were worth less than they had been before the bridge was announced. The very project that was destroying these homes was being used to justify paying less for them. The families of Milsons Point, like those of the Rocks, received their notices and were given limited time to vacate. Some had lived in their homes for decades. Some were elderly couples who had retired to the North Shore, specifically for the quiet and the views. Some were young families who had stretched their finances to buy a harborside home that was supposed to be their future. All of them were told to leave. The cottages came down. Lavender Street lost houses. Fitzroy Street lost houses. Burton Street, Middle Miss Street, and the unnamed lanes between them all contributed to the widening gap that would become the northern approach. The demolition crews worked quickly, and behind them the landscape transformed from a residential neighborhood into a construction zone. Lavender Bay, that sheltered inlet where children had swum and fishermen had cast lines, was permanently altered. The western end would eventually become the site of Luna Park, opening in 1935 on land transformed by the bridge construction. Just when the displaced families thought they understood the full extent of their losses, the construction itself added new dimensions of disruption. While the demolitions cleared the land, the construction crews began the massive civil engineering works required to build the bridge foundations and approach spans. On the southern side, the sandstone ridge of the Rocks was excavated to accommodate the southern abutment and the anchor tunnels that would hold the arch in place against the enormous forces of its own weight and the traffic it would carry. The excavation work was noisy, dusty, and constant. Families living in the remaining houses of the Rocks, Those whose homes had not yet been demolished or were just outside the resumption zone endured months and then years of blasting, drilling, and heavy machinery operating from dawn until dusk. The narrow streets filled with construction traffic, dust coated every surface. The ground shook with each detonation in the rock. The construction of the bridge itself began in earnest in 1924, with the building of the approach spans on both shores. These were substantial structures in their own right, steel and concrete spans that carried the roadway and railway from ground level up to the height of the main arch deck. On the southern side, the approach spans marched through what had been the rocks, each new pier sunk into ground that had recently been someone's front garden or back lane. The main contract had been awarded to Dorman Long and Company of Middlesbrough, England. The firm had won the tender with a design for a two-hinged steel through-arch bridge, beating competing proposals from 20 firms around the world. The contract value was £4,217,000, the largest single infrastructure contract in Australian history. Dorman Long brought their own engineers and supervisors from England, but the workforce that would actually build the bridge was overwhelmingly Australian. At its peak, the construction employed approximately 1,400 men. They were ironworkers, riveters, boilermakers, crane operators, laborers, and specialists of various kinds. Many of them came from the working-class suburbs of Sydney, from the same communities that had been disrupted or destroyed by the bridge project. Some had been personally displaced, others had friends or family members who had lost homes. The bridge was being built by the people it had displaced, and that irony was not lost on any of them, even if it was lost on the politicians and engineers who gave the speeches. The work was extraordinarily dangerous. The construction of the arch required men to work at heights of over 130 meters above the harbor. The arch was built outward from both shores simultaneously, each half cantilevered over the water without support from below. The workers climbed along the top cords and bottom cords of the arch on narrow steel beams, with no safety harnesses, no guardrails, and no protection against the wind that swept through the harbor at that height. The riveting crews were the most visible and the most vulnerable. Their job was to connect the individual steel members of the arch, using heated rivets. The process required a team of 4 men working in tight coordination. A heater boy kept a portable forge burning on the steelwork, heating rivets to cherry red. A thrower tossed the glowing rivet through the air to a catcher, who snagged it in a metal cone. A holder-up positioned the rivet in the hole, while the riveter drove it home with a pneumatic hammer. The noise was deafening. The footing was precarious. The rivets were white-hot, and below them was nothing but 100 meters of air and then the harbor. 16 men died during the construction of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. 16 workers who went to work in the morning and did not come home. They fell from the arch. They were struck by falling equipment. They were crushed between steel members that shifted unexpectedly. They were killed by the routine hazards of working at extreme heights with inadequate safety equipment in an era when worker deaths were considered an acceptable cost of major construction. Henri Millard fell from the arch. John Brady was killed by falling rivets. Thomas Sullivan was crushed. The names are recorded in official documents, but they are rarely recited in the celebratory accounts of the bridge. The memorial to the bridge workers, when it was eventually installed, was a modest affair. 16 men, 16 families who lost a father, a husband, a son, 16 funerals in the working-class suburbs of Sydney, and the construction did not pause for any of them. And somehow it gets worse when you consider the economic context. The bridge was being built during the Great Depression. By 1930, unemployment in New South Wales exceeded 30%. Men lined up for bridge jobs knowing the danger because the alternative was destitution. In winter, the steel was cold enough to burn skin. In summer, the black-painted members blistered through gloves. The wind at the top could stagger a man on a beam the width of his boots. There were no safety nets, and below nothing but harbor. The Depression also compounded the suffering of the displaced families. Those who had been forced from their homes in the early and mid-1920s had entered a housing market that was already tight. By the late 1920s, that market had seized up completely. Rents rose. Vacancies disappeared. Families who had received inadequate compensation for their homes were now competing for scarce accommodation in a city where even employed people were struggling to pay rent. There is no comprehensive record of what happened to every family displaced by the bridge. No government agency tracked their outcomes. No follow-up survey assessed whether the compensation had been sufficient to re-establish their lives. They were displaced, paid, and forgotten. The administrative process that had taken their homes did not extend to caring about what happened after. For a while, the construction front offered a different kind of spectacle. By the late 1920s, the two halves of the arch were growing visibly toward each other across the harbor. The creeper cranes that moved along the top cords were visible from across the city, mechanical silhouettes against the sky that became a daily point of fascination for Sydneysiders. People gathered on the harbor foreshores to watch the progress. Newspapers published regular updates. The bridge, despite everything it had cost, was becoming a source of civic pride. The engineering was genuinely extraordinary. Each half of the arch was built outward from its shore, cantilevered over the water with no temporary support from below. The precision required was remarkable. The two halves had to meet in the middle with tolerances measured in millimeters, despite the constant movement caused by temperature changes, wind loading, and the increasing weight of the steelwork itself. Bradfield's calculations had to account for the thermal expansion of thousands of tons of steel. On a hot summer day, the arch could expand by several centimeters. On a cold night, it contracted by the same amount. The construction sequence had to accommodate these movements while maintaining structural integrity at every stage. On August 1930, the two halves of the arch met in the middle of the harbor. The closure was celebrated across Sydney. The newspapers ran photographs of workers connecting the final members. Politicians issued statements of congratulation. Bradfield, now in his 60s, was hailed as the father of the bridge. The engineering triumph was real and deserved acknowledgement. What Bradfield and his team had achieved was genuinely world-class. But the celebration was, which looking back was either oblivious or deliberately selective, focused entirely on the steel and entirely silent on the people. Nobody gave a speech about the 800 houses. Nobody acknowledged the families. Nobody counted the cost in anything other than pounds and tons and rivets. The deck was completed over the following 18 months. Road and rail surfaces were laid. The four massive granite-faced pylons, which were decorative rather than structural, were finished and became the bridge's most recognizable visual feature. Testing was conducted. Load trials confirmed the bridge could carry far more than its designed capacity. Everything was ready for the ceremony that would declare the bridge open. March 19, 1992, opening day. The event the entire city had been building toward for a decade. The ceremony was planned as a moment of unqualified national triumph. New South Wales Premier Jack Lang, the firebrand Labour leader who had been in office during the final years of construction, was to cut a ceremonial ribbon at the southern end of the bridge. Hundreds of thousands of Sydneysiders lined the harbour foreshore. The bridge deck was packed with dignitaries, officials, military units, schoolchildren, and invited guests. Brass bands played, flags flew from the pylons. The mood was euphoric. In the depths of the Depression, with unemployment ravaging the country, the bridge offered something rare and desperately needed: a reason to celebrate. Lang stepped forward to cut the ribbon, and in one of the most bizarre and theatrical moments in Australian political history, a man on horseback charged forward out of the crowd, drew a cavalry sword, and slashed the ribbon before Lang's scissors could close. Captain Francis de Groot was a member of the New Guard, a right-wing paramilitary organization that despised Lang and his Labour government. De Groot had dressed in military uniform and positioned himself among the mounted military escort. De Groot was immediately seized by police, dragged from his horse, and arrested. The ribbon was hastily retied. Lang, visibly shaken, cut it properly. The bridge was officially opened, and the crowd surged forward to cross it for the first time. The De Groot incident became the defining anecdote of opening day. It is retold in every history of the bridge, every documentary, every school textbook. It is funny, dramatic, and perfectly Australian in its combination of political outrage and theatrical absurdity. It is also, whether intentionally or not, the perfect distraction from the story that nobody wanted to tell on opening day. Because here is what else happened on March 19, 1932, that nobody wrote about. Among the crowds that crossed the bridge that day were families who had been displaced from the Rocks and Milson's Point. They walked across the structure that had cost them their homes. They walked on the roadway that had been built on the land where their houses once stood. They looked down at the harbor from a height that no resident of the Rocks had ever experienced from the ridge, because the ridge itself had been excavated and reshaped to accommodate the southern pylons. Some of them had lived in these streets for 3 generations. Now they were tourists on a bridge that occupied the footprint of their former lives. They were anonymous in the celebrating crowd. No journalist interviewed them. No photographer took their picture. No politician acknowledged their presence or their sacrifice. In the vast archive of opening day documentation, photographs, newsreel footage, newspaper reports, official speeches, the people who paid the highest price for the bridge are completely invisible. The celebration continued for weeks. Sydneysiders crossed the bridge in their hundreds of thousands, marveling at the views, the width of the roadway, the rumble of trains beneath the deck. The bridge changed the city immediately. Travel times between north and south dropped from 30 minutes by ferry to 5 minutes by car or train. Property values on the North Shore surged as the barrier of the harbor was finally eliminated. The economic impact was undeniable. New suburbs on the North Shore experienced building booms. Businesses relocated. The population of the northern suburbs grew rapidly as the bridge made commuting feasible for the first time. North Sydney, Chatswood, and the Upper North Shore became some of the most desirable residential addresses in Australia, their value created directly by the bridge that had destroyed the harbourside neighbourhoods of Milsons Point. The ferry companies that had served the harbour for generations were devastated. Passenger numbers collapsed almost overnight. Within a few years, several of the great ferry routes were discontinued. The wharves that had been the beating heart of waterfront life, the same wharves that had sustained the community of the Rocks for a century, fell silent. The ferry workers, like the displaced residents, became collateral damage of the bridge. Meanwhile, the Depression continued to grind. The opening of the bridge coincided with the worst years of economic catastrophe. Unemployment remained above 25% in New South Wales. Eviction camps had sprung up in parks across Sydney. Men who had been skilled tradesmen were selling pencils on street corners. The bridge was a symbol of hope, but the reality on the streets of Sydney was hopelessness. The toll charged to cross the bridge was 6p for a car, a significant amount for a working family in 1932. Many of the people who had been displaced from the Rocks and Milsons Point could not afford to drive across the bridge that had replaced their homes. They could take the train, which was cheaper, but the train stations at each end of the bridge occupied ground that had been cleared of houses. The circularity was inescapable. Everywhere they turned, the bridge occupied the space where their lives had been. For the city, the bridge was transformative. For the people who had been displaced to build it, the transformation was already complete. They had been transformed from residents into statistics, from homeowners into compensation claimants, from members of a community into individuals scattered across a city that was too deep in depression to notice their struggle. If you found this worth watching, hit subscribe. I cover the lost, demolished, and abandoned places of Australia every week. The stories the official histories leave out, and there are more of them than you think. While the new bridge carried its first 1,000 days of traffic overhead, the damage continued to accumulate on the ground below. The Rocks that survived the bridge demolitions was a fundamentally different place from the neighborhood that had existed before 1923. The community had been shattered. The population had dropped dramatically. Many of the streets and laneways that had given the area its character were simply gone, buried under approach roads, ramp structures, and construction fill. The buildings that remained stood in the permanent shadow of the bridge, their windows looking up at a steel arch instead of across at the harbor. The surviving pubs grew quieter. The shops that remained lost their regular customers. The families who had not been directly displaced found themselves living in a neighborhood that no longer functioned as one. Your neighbor was gone. Your corner shop was gone. The family across the lane whose children played with your children was gone. You were still physically in the Rocks, but the Rocks as you had known it no longer existed. On the northern shore, the transformation was even more complete. Milsons Point had been permanently converted from a residential suburb to a transport interchange. The approach roads, the toll plaza, the railway station, and the rail yards consumed the land that had been private homes. The harbor views that had drawn families to the area were now framed by concrete pylons and steel beams. The quiet residential character of the suburb was replaced by the constant noise and movement of bridge traffic. The bridge also generated new pressures on the surviving areas. Commercial development followed the traffic. Properties near the bridge approaches were rezoned and redeveloped. The remaining houses in the Rocks, those that had escaped demolition, were now surrounded by an environment that was hostile to residential life. Noise, traffic, commercial activity, the incentives to stay disappeared, and the remaining residents gradually drifted away over the following decades. The decline of the Rocks between the 1930s and the 1970s was slow, grinding, and largely invisible to the rest of Sydney. The neighborhood that had once been the cradle of the colony became a forgotten pocket of the inner city, overshadowed literally by the bridge and figuratively by the gleaming commercial district that was rising to its south. Government investment dried up. Building maintenance was deferred. Properties that the government had resumed during the bridge construction and never used sat vacant and deteriorating for decades. Empty sandstone shells with boarded-up windows lined streets that had once been bustling with maritime commerce. The wharves that had sustained the Rocks economically were closing too. Containerization was transforming the shipping industry. The old finger wharves along the harbor foreshore, where gangs of dock workers had once unloaded cargo by hand, were being replaced by massive container terminals at Port Botany and elsewhere. The waterfront jobs that had anchored the community to the location were disappearing. The workers who remained had less and less reason to live in the rocks when the work itself had moved to the other side of the city. By the 1960s, the rocks had the appearance of a neighborhood waiting to die. Many of the surviving buildings were in poor condition. The residential population had dwindled to a fraction of its pre-bridge numbers. The area was perceived by city planners and developers as blighted, underutilized, and ripe for wholesale redevelopment. The word slum appeared regularly in government reports about the precinct, the same word that had been used to justify the plague demolitions in 1900 and the bridge demolitions in 1923. The harbor, meanwhile, had been cut off from the city by layers of infrastructure. The harbor bridge overhead, the Cahill Expressway at eye level, wharves and warehouses at ground level. Sydney had turned its back on the very waterfront that had given it life. The city that had been built because of the harbor now treated the harbor as an obstacle to be bridged, tunneled under, and fenced off. Pay attention to that pattern, because it explains everything that came next. But this wasn't just about the rocks in Milson's Point anymore. The bridge demolitions had established a template that would be applied again and again as Sydney continued to grow. In the 1950s, the NSW government decided Sydney needed an elevated expressway to connect the western suburbs to the harbour crossing. The era of the motorcar had arrived, and governments across Australia were infatuated with American-style freeway planning. Los Angeles was the model. Elevated concrete expressways were the future, and Sydney, with its harbour crossing already in place, was deemed to need a fast road connection from the bridge to the eastern and western arterials. The route they chose ran directly along the harbour foreshore at Circular Quay on concrete pylons that blocked the views between the city and the water. The Cahill Expressway, named after Premier Joe Cahill, who championed the project, required another round of demolitions and resumptions in the area around the rocks and Circular Quay. Buildings that had survived the bridge construction were now demolished for the expressway. The waterfront that had been the economic heart of colonial Sydney was buried beneath a layer of concrete. What the bridge had started, the expressway finished. The Cahill Expressway carved a brutal concrete scar across the face of Circular Quay, severing the visual and physical connection between the city and its harbor in a way that urbanists, architects, and ordinary Sydneysiders have lamented for 70 years. Stand at Circular Quay today and look up. The expressway is still there, a flat-topped concrete deck running across the face of the harbor. Below it, in the shadow, is the space where the harbor once met the city. It is widely regarded as one of the worst planning decisions in Australian urban history. And it followed exactly the same logic as the bridge demolitions. Infrastructure first, community second. Engineering lines on a map, and the people in the way are expected to move. The same pattern played out across Sydney through the 1960s and 1970s. Expressway proposals threatened inner-city suburbs like Glebe, Newtown, and Ultimo. Residents were issued resumption notices that echoed the ones delivered to the Rocks families half a century earlier. The government's approach had not changed. The assumption was still the same. Progress required sacrifice, and the sacrifice was always demanded of the same people. Working-class communities, inner-city residents. People without the wealth or political connections to defend themselves. The pattern was only broken in the 1970s, and it was broken not by politicians or planners but by construction workers. The Builders Labourers Federation, led by Jack Mundy, Joe Owens, and Bob Pringle, imposed what became known as green bans on development sites across Sydney. Under a green ban, union members refused to perform demolition or construction work on sites that the community wanted to preserve. The first green ban, in 1971, protected Kelly's Bush in Hunters Hill from residential development. The movement quickly spread in the Rocks. The green bans became critical. The government's plans called for wholesale replacement of the surviving heritage buildings with high-rise office towers. Residents and heritage advocates opposed the plans but lacked the power to stop them. The BLF placed a green ban on the demolition sites, and the plans ground to a halt. You cannot demolish a building if the workers refuse to touch it. The government tried to break the bans. They threatened the union. They attempted non-union labor. The BLF held firm. Mundy argued that construction workers built the city and had a duty to have a say in what was destroyed. Without those green bans, the Rocks would almost certainly have been demolished completely. The fact that it exists today as a heritage precinct is not because the government valued its history, it is because ordinary working people physically prevented its final destruction. Australia's heritage has not been preserved by its institutions. It has been preserved by communities fighting against institutions, and the communities do not always win. The terraces of Miller's Point, just south of the rocks, were sold off by the government in the 2010s. Their elderly public housing tenants were displaced in a process that echoed the bridge resumptions 90 years earlier. The rocks today is a heritage precinct, and by many measures it has been beautifully restored. The surviving sandstone buildings have been repaired and maintained. The laneways have been cleaned and paved with smooth flagstones. Heritage interpretation panels explain the history of the area in measured educational language. Weekend markets fill the streets with stalls selling handmade jewelry, artisanal cheese, and organic soap. Restaurants serve brunch to tourists and locals at prices that would cover a week's groceries for the families who once lived here. The Argyle Cut, the hand-hewn passage through the sandstone ridge that convicts carved over 18 years, is now a tourist attraction. People walk through it, photograph the chisel marks in the stone, and admire the engineering. They do not generally reflect on the fact that the houses that once lined the streets above the cut were demolished for the bridge. The Rocks Discovery Museum tells the history of the area with care and nuance, and it is one of the few places in the precinct where the displacement is acknowledged in any detail. But a museum visited by thousands is not the same as a memorial seen by millions. The hero of Waterloo still pours beer. The Fortune of War still claims to be Sydney's oldest pub. The Lord Nelson still stands on the corner of Kent and Argyle streets. These survivals are celebrated, and rightly so, but they are survivals. They are the exception, not the rule. For every building that stands, a dozen were demolished. For every pub that survived, a church, a school, a shop, and a row of houses were pulled down. The absence of a proper memorial is, perhaps, the most telling detail of all. Other cities that have undertaken major displacements for infrastructure projects have found ways to acknowledge what was lost. New York's Seneca Village, the community displaced to build Central Park, is now marked by plaques and included in the park's official history. Boston's West End, demolished in the 1950s for urban renewal, has a dedicated museum. Even in Australia, the displaced communities of Maralinga, where Aboriginal people were moved to make way for British nuclear testing, have received formal recognition and apology. The families displaced by the Sydney Harbour Bridge have received none of this. No memorial, no plaque on the bridge itself, no formal acknowledgement from the NSW government, no apology. The 800 houses and the thousands of people who lived in them exist only in archives, in a handful of photographs, and now in accounts like this one, but there is something fundamentally hollow about the restored rocks. The buildings are there, the people are not. The terraces house boutique hotels, art galleries, and upmarket shops. The pubs serve craft beer to tourists at prices that would have astonished the dock workers who used to drink there. The physical fabric of the neighborhood has been preserved, but the community that gave it meaning was destroyed 70 years before the restoration began. Walk through the rocks on any Saturday afternoon, and you will see tourists buying postcards of the Harbour Bridge. You will photograph heritage buildings that are immaculately maintained. You will read plaques that tell you when each building was constructed and what it was used for. You will eat fish and chips at a restaurant with harbor views and think what a lovely afternoon it has been. You will walk along George Street North and not know that the western side of this street was demolished for the bridge approach. You will cross under the Bradfield Highway, named for the engineer who designed the destruction, and not know that you are passing through what was once a residential street. You will admire the massive sandstone pylons and not know that the granite cladding cost more than the government paid for many of the houses it demolished. You will take a photograph from the pedestrian footpath on the bridge's eastern side and not know that you are standing directly above the site of houses that were lived in continuously from the 1840s until the 1920s. The bridge climb experience, which takes tourists to the very top of the arch for premium prices, includes historical narration about the construction, the engineering, and the De Groot incident. It does not include narration about the 800 homes. It does not mention the families. It does not acknowledge the displacement. The most expensive way to experience the bridge is also the most thoroughly sanitized. You will not find a single memorial, a single plaque, a single permanent acknowledgement of the families who were displaced to build the bridge. There is no monument to the 800 homes. There is no list of the streets that were demolished. There is no record, in the public space of the rocks itself, of the largest forced displacement in Sydney's history. At Milson's Point, the erasure is even more total. The streets that were demolished for the northern approach do not exist on any modern map. There is no trace of the cottages that once lined them. The landscape is dominated entirely by bridge infrastructure, by Luna Park, by the railway station, by the broad roadways that carry traffic to and from the bridge deck. If you did not already know that a residential neighborhood had once stood in this exact location, There is nothing in the physical environment to tell you. The stone from the ridge built the houses. The houses were demolished to clear the ridge. The ridge was excavated to anchor the bridge, and now nobody remembers the houses at all. There is a photograph held in the State Library of New South Wales. It was taken around 1925, during the early phase of the demolitions. The photograph shows a row of terrace houses on one of the doomed streets of the rocks. The houses are modest but solid, sandstone walls, iron roofs, laundry hanging from a line strung between the upper windows. A woman stands in a doorway, looking toward the camera across a century of distance. Behind her, visible above the roofline, is the steel framework of the bridge's southern approach. Already rising, already casting its shadow, she is looking at the camera. The bridge is looking down at her. Within a year, her house would be demolished. She would receive a payment determined by a government valuer who had never met her. She would leave the street where she had lived her entire life and relocate to somewhere we cannot identify, because nobody kept that record. She would become one of the thousands of anonymous displaced, the human cost that was calculated in pounds and shillings rather than in grief. The government did not commission a photographic survey of the neighborhoods before demolition. No architect documented the buildings that would be lost. No social survey recorded the names and stories of the families who lived there. The absence of documentation was not accidental. It was convenient. You cannot mourn what you cannot see. You cannot preserve what has not been recorded. And you cannot hold a government accountable for a cost that was never officially counted. This is the pattern that defines Australia's relationship with its built heritage. We build extraordinary things. We celebrate them as symbols of national achievement and engineering brilliance. And we systematically erase any evidence of what was sacrificed to create them. Look at any major Australian city and you will find the same story repeating. Melbourne demolished the Federal Coffee Palace, once the largest hotel in the Southern Hemisphere. Brisbane tore down Cloudland, the Art Deco ballroom that defined a generation of Queensland's social life. Perth destroyed the Esplanade Hotel. Adelaide leveled countless sandstone buildings from the colonial era. Every state, every capital, carries the scars of demolitions that were justified at the time as progress and are mourned today as irreplaceable losses. The Sydney Harbour Bridge is the template for all of them. The original, the first and greatest example of Australia choosing steel over sandstone, infrastructure over community, progress over the people who stood in its path. And it is the example that has been most thoroughly forgotten, because the bridge itself is so magnificent that its beauty obscures its cost. Bradfield himself died in 1943, still celebrated as the father of the bridge. Streets bear his name, a suburb in western Sydney bears his name, an expressway bears his name. The Bradfield Highway crosses the bridge itself, named for the man who made it possible. His engineering was, and remains, brilliant. The bridge is one of the finest steel arch structures ever built, and it has served Sydney for over 90 years with minimal structural intervention. As an engineer, Bradfield was exceptional. But engineering brilliance does not excuse social destruction, and the spending priorities of the project reveal where the government's values truly lay. The four massive pylons at each end of the bridge, the granite-clad towers that are the bridge's most recognizable visual feature, are decorative. They serve no structural function. The arch carries itself. The pylons were added purely for aesthetic reasons, to give the bridge a sense of gravitas and permanence that the steel arch alone was deemed insufficient to provide. The cost of facing those pylons in granite, imported from Moruya on the south coast, was substantial. Money was found for decorative stone cladding on towers that held up nothing. Money was not found for fair compensation for the families whose homes were demolished to make way for the foundations beneath those same towers. Bradfield had the influence to advocate for fair compensation. He could have designed approaches that minimized residential displacement. He could have used his standing with the government to insist that displaced families be properly supported and rehoused. There is no evidence that he did any of these things. In his papers, reports, and public statements, the displaced families are essentially invisible. They were a logistical problem, not a human one. They were resumptions on a plan, not people in homes. The real question is not whether the Sydney Harbour Bridge should have been built. Of course it should have. Sydney needed a harbour crossing, and the bridge Bradfield designed has served the city with extraordinary reliability for nearly a century. It is a masterwork of structural engineering, and it deserves the admiration it receives. The real question is why the cost was borne entirely by the people who could least afford it. Why working-class families in the Rocks received a fraction of the true value of their homes, while the government spent millions on granite cladding for decorative pylons that served no structural purpose. Why no serious effort was made to rehouse displaced families or track their welfare. Why the destruction of entire neighborhoods was processed as a routine administrative matter rather than recognized as a profound act of social disruption that demanded commensurate support and acknowledgement. And the deepest question of all, why do we still not talk about it? Why the most visited landmark in Australia carries no public record of the lives it displaced? Why 8 million people a year walk across a bridge that was built on the rubble of a community, and almost none of them know? The Sydney Harbour Bridge stands today as it has stood since 1932. Steel gray against the harbor blue. The arch curves from shore to shore with an elegance that 94 years have not diminished. It is beautiful, it is essential. It is a monument to what Australia can build when it commits fully to a vision. It is also a monument to what Australia is willing to destroy, and until we are prepared to acknowledge both of those truths together, we are only telling half the story. 8 million people a year take that photograph from the middle of the bridge. The Opera House on one side, Circular Quay on the other. The harbor underneath. Directly beneath their feet, under the concrete and the steel and the asphalt, is the ground where a neighborhood once stood, where children ran through laneways between sandstone terraces, where women hung laundry on lines strung between the upper floors, where a dock worker came home after a shift on the wharves and sat on his front step and looked out at the harbor. That harbor is still there. The man is not. His house is not. His street is not. His neighborhood is not. But now at least you know he existed. And that is more than the official history ever gave him. If stories like this matter to you, the kind that get left out of the textbooks and the tourist brochures, click the video on screen now. It is another piece of Australia that was demolished, abandoned, and forgotten, and it is just as worth remembering as this one.